At 6:20 on a gray January morning in 1944, just outside Cisterna di Latina on the road to Rome, Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Hughes pressed his cheek against the frozen mud and listened to steel giants close in on his men. 26 years old, a Kansas farm boy turned squad leader in the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division, he had survived 10 brutal actions since landing in Italy. Now, on a low, sodden field cut by ditches and shattered olive groves, he heard the grinding of dozens of tank tracks tightening a steel noose. For fewer than 40 exhausted, they were supposed to be advancing, not hiding. Before dawn, his understrength platoon had pushed forward as part of a probing attack ordered to feel out German positions along a secondary road leading toward Cisterna. The night had been a misery of sleet and icy, the men stumbling through muck that clung to their boots and froze on their overcoats. Half of their radios had already gone dead from water and rough hand. By first light, they were off the map, crouched in a shallow depression between two knolls, with no clear line of retreat and no contact with the neighboring units they were supposed to tie in with. Tommy could taste iron at the back of his throat, the familiar sour fear that never quite left him. Before the war he had known exactly how his days would go. Lawn milking, repairing fence lines with his father, Sunday dinners with his mother, who wrote letters in a careful, looping hand. He had promised her, on the depot platform back in 1942, that he would come home with all my pieces. That promise had carried him through North Africa and into the mountains. Here, with the earth trembling under the approach of enemy armor, it felt like a stupid, childish thing to have ever said. The first tank appeared over the rise like a blunt-nosed animal emerging from fog, its long 75mm gun sweeping slowly, looking for prey. Another followed, and another, until Tommy lost count. They spread out in a half-circle, hulking silhouettes against the low winter light, the muzzles of their guns probing every fold in the ground as if sniffing for hiding men. Within minutes it was plain, this was not a patrol. Somehow, his small knot of infantry had blundered straight into the center of a German armored sweep. Counting the turrets as they turned, he realized with a strange, cold clarity that there were at least 30 tanks in view and more engine noises shifting in the mist behind them. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think. His men were scattered around him in shallow scrapes and shell holes, hugging the earth. They had rifles, a bar, a single light machine gun, and a handful of bazooka rounds that might dent a tank's side if fired from within spitting distance. Against 38 armored vehicles and whatever infantry followed them, it was nothing. The simple arithmetic of it pressed down on him like the gray sky. Yet giving up was not an option he could entertain out loud. If he let the panic show in his voice, the thin thread keeping these men from bolting would snap. He inched closer to his radio operator, privately, and tapped his shoulder. The handset pressed to Tommy's ear crackled with nothing but static. The main company net had been quiet for nearly 20 minutes. Somewhere, wires were cut, sets were shorted, or officers were already too busy fighting for their own skin. "Try battalion again," Tommy whispered. Lee's fingers were numb, his face raw from wind and rain, but he did as ordered, working the broken dial and sending plaintive calls into empty air. The nearest tank halted, turret swinging. A flare arced up from the German side, burning white against the low clouds, and for a heartbeat, the whole field glowed stark and merciless. Tommy could see everything. The ragged line of his men in their muddy foxhole, the crushed farm walls to their rear, the distant spire of a village church to the south. It struck him that from the tank commander's elevated perches, with their cupolas and optics, his platoon must look exactly like what it was, a lonely, exposed pocket, cut off from support. As the flare burned out, the world snapped back into a blue-gray gloom. For a long moment nothing happened. The tanks idled, engines growling, steam puffing from their exhausts. It was as if both sides were holding their breath, waiting for someone to make the first irreversible move. Tommy's mind slipped, unbidden, to an earlier lesson in armor, North Africa, spring of '43, when he had watched German panzers roll straight over a shallow American position that had tried to. Men had broken from their holes in panic, thinking they could outpace steel. The tanks hadn't even bothered to fire. They had just advanced, crushing foxholes, spraying machine gun fire, and letting the fleeing silhouettes flail and fall. The memory was a knife that cut through his own rising terror. Running here, across open fields already churned to glue, under the guns of nearly 40 tanks, would be suicide. Staying put, however, meant waiting to be bracketed by high explosive shells, shredded where they lay. He wiped his hand across his smearing mud into the stubble on his jaw, and realized that what he needed was neither a charge nor collapse. He needed something the Germans would not expect from a half-frozen American platoon with no support. Something that would make 38 tanks hesitate, if only for 5 minutes. It came to him in a flash, the way his father had once scared off a pack of coyotes that were circling the family's livestock back on the farm. Instead of firing wildly and wasting ammunition, his father had walked out into the yard at night with a lantern swinging high, shouting and whistling, making himself seem bigger, louder, and far more dangerous he was. The coyotes, uncertain of what they faced, had slunk away. Here, the coyotes were made of armor plate and guns, but they were still commanded by men who dreaded one thing above all: stumbling into a well-laid trap. An idea that felt like madness took hold and would not let go. He crawled over to the nearest foxhole where Corporal Ruse, his best shot and longest-serving man, crouched with the bar. Ruse's dark eyes flicked to him, searching his face. Tommy could almost hear the unspoken question. "What now, Sarge?" "We're not running," Tommy whispered. "We make them think they ran into something bigger than..." Ruse glanced toward the tanks and then back, skeptical. "With what, Sarge?" "Harsh language, noise, confusion, lies," Tommy said. "We've still got flares, right? Smoke, white phosphorus." They did, scattered among their ammo, held in reserve for a push that now would never come. Tommy began to piece together his hopeless trick in clipped phrases, laying out assignments in the few minutes before the first shell inevitably landed. Men were to pop flares in staggered patterns, throw smoke grenades in directions that suggested an unseen line of guns beyond the ridge, and fire their few remaining bazooka rounds not at the tank's heavily armored fronts, but to kick up plumes of dirt in front of them as if rounds were falling short from unseen artillery. Most importantly, they would use their radios not to beg for help that might not arrive, but to broadcast what they wanted the Germans to overhear. The radios crackled out into the chill air. Even if the American net was dead, Tommy knew German signals intelligence units were always listening. From a trench outside Salerno, he had heard his own colonel explain how the enemy routinely picked up sloppy American transmissions and used them to guess at plans. Today, he intended to weaponize that weakness. "Lee," he said, pressing close in the foxhole, "I want you to sound like you're calling in the biggest artillery barrage you've ever seen. Don't wait for answers. Just feed them numbers, grids, times. Make it sound like the whole division is sitting behind us with their guns up and aimed at those tanks." Lee's eyes went wide. "But nobody's, I know," Tommy cut in. "They don't." There was no time for debate. A tank several hundred yards out fired a ranging shot, the shell hissing overhead and bursting, with a sickening crack behind the American line. Dirt and shrapnel pattered down. Someone cried out, cut short. The next seconds stretched like wire. Tommy slapped Lee's shoulder and the young radio operator began his performance, his voice shaking but loud. Red battery, this is Able 3-2. Concentrate fire, Sector Dog 9-4. Column of enemy armor, I say again, column of enemy armor. Prepare time on target, repeat, time on target. Fire for effect." He rattled off fake coordinates, mixing real map reference with invented jargon, the words tumbling out in a stream that sounded technical enough to anyone raised on the same man. Tommy added his own bursts, leaning into the handset with the flat authority he had heard in artillery observers' voices, calling imaginary batteries by name and ordering phantom salvos. Around them, his men began launching their part of the route. A green flare shot up and burst, followed by red and white, in patterns that would have meant something entirely different had there been an actual battalion fire plan behind them. Smoke grenades rolled down into the low ground and blossomed into thick, roiling curtains that obscured parts of the American position while leaving the tanks clearly silhouetted in the gaps. The first bazooka roared, the backblast scorching the air. Its rocket flew wildly high and to the side, exploding in an empty patch of field well short of any armor. To a German commander behind armored glass, however, it would have looked like one of several ranging rounds falling short. A second rocket followed from a slightly different angle, tearing into the earth in front of the nearest tank and sending a geyser of mud and snow skyward. From the German perspective, the battlefield suddenly transformed. Moments before, they had been the hunters, encircling what looked like a stray American unit. Now, flares arced into the sky, smoke boiled, explosions bloomed in seemingly random places, and on the airwaves an American voice urgently called in what sounded like a division-scale artillery strike. Inside his turret, a German tank commander named Klaus Ritter. Tommy would never know his name, only sense his reactions might have lifted his field glasses and frowned. The terrain here was treacherous, cut with irrigation ditches and drained fields. The German armored doctrine drilled into him warned against charging blindly into areas where hidden anti-tank guns might be sighted. The Allies, he knew, loved to lure tanks into killing grounds where dug-in 57mm or 76mm guns could rake their flanks. Another explosion shook the field, this one closer, as an American rifle grenade detonated against an old stone wall near the tanks. The timing was coincidence, the psychological effect was not. To Ritter and his fellow commanders, it could easily appear as the opening splashes of a carefully plotted artillery screen landing around them. Tommy watched through a crack in the earth as the lead tanks slowed and then, to his barely restrained amazement, halted. Their turrets rotated, scanning the hazy horizon. One fired a burst from its coaxial machine gun into a hedge, more to test for reaction than in anger. Another backed up a few meters, swiveling to cover a noose. The noose around his men had stopped tightening. He did not kid himself. They were not safe. One report to a cautious battalion HQ might bring real German artillery down on this field, or a bolder tank officer might decide to simply sweep forward and trust to armor. But every minute the German crews hesitated was a minute his men remained alive. The hopeless trick was working for now, but it needed another layer. Hesitation would buy them minutes. To escape, they needed the enemy to make a wrong move. As he hugged the earth and listened to Lee keep up his stream of invented fire mission, Tommy thought about the wider situation. The Italian campaign at this point in early 1941 was a grinding, miserable affair. The Allies had fought their way up the peninsula only to be checked by a series of German defensive lines anchored on mountains, rivers, and fortified towns. Every advance was costly. Every day, higher commands searched for ways to unhinge the enemy front and open the road to Rome. Operations near Cisterna and Anzio were part of that effort. Risky thrusts aimed at outflanking the main German position. That also meant that somewhere behind Tom, real artillery guns were indeed in place, pointing at likely avenues of German movement. That his particular calls were fiction did not mean German commanders could count on the absence of fire. He decided to press that nerve. Slithering to the next hole, he grabbed Private Kowalski, the best imitator in the platoon, a lanky kid from Chicago who could mimic accents and voices for laughs. This time, the mimicry might keep them breathing. Tommy gave him brief instruction. Pretend to be another observer on a different frequency, duplicating the illusion of multiple eyes on target. Soon two American voices crackled across the ether, talking over each other, one calling for concentrations on target Victor 7 and the other adjusting Phantom Fire 50 left. 100 over. You're walking it right onto their lead element. It sounded messy, urgent, and above all real. Out in the murk, engine noises shifted. Some tanks turned their hulls, angling away from the low ground that might now be a killing zone. Others appeared to be backing up entirely, their commanders deciding they wanted infantry screens ahead of them before advancing into what might be a pre-sighted cauldron. Tommy's gambit had created the illusion of a much larger American force waiting just behind the ridge with guns and perhaps even armor of its own. The German solution, classically, was to regroup and call in their own supporting arms before pushing forward. That process took time that Tommy could convert into distance. He summoned the section leaders with hand signals, dragging them into a cramped huddle behind a broken stone wall. Shell bursts and machine gun tracers still cut occasional stitches across the field, but no full-on storm of fire had fallen yet. His voice was low and steady as he laid out the next stage. They would not break and run in one panicked mass. Instead, the platoon would exfiltrate in small groups, peeling back through the shallow drainage ditch at their rear, always leaving behind just enough men to keep up the illusion of an intact, defiant line. They would carry their radios backwards with them, continuing the ghost conversations until the very last possible moment. There was resistance, of course. Corporal Ruiz argued to stay up front, to maintain the pretense and cover the others as long as possible. Tommy felt the pull of that instinct himself, the reflex to stand and fight in a clear, simple way, to be a hero in the blunt, doomed sense. But the war in Italy had taught him different lessons. Bravery here was not only measured by charges and last stands. Sometimes it was measured by the ability to swallow pride, accept ugly choices, and keep men alive for battles that still lay ahead. You'll get your chance to shoot later, Tommy told Ruiz softly. Right now the job is to make them think they're in trouble. That means living long enough to let them keep thinking. Reluctantly, Ruiz nodded. The rotation began. 2 men at a time slid into the ditch and began the painful crawl rearward, dragging gear that had doubled in weight with mud and water. The first group's task was to reach a modest rise dotted with olive trees a few hundred yards back and set up as if they were fresh troops manning a second line. From there, they would make just enough noise, random rifle shots, flare pops to keep the mental picture in German minds of layers of defense. Tommy stayed with the last dozen, including the radio operators. Here the temptation to simply vanish was at its strongest. The tanks were no more than 400 yards away now, some of them just ghostly shapes in the smoke. One decisive order from a German major could send them rumbling forward in a sudden rush that would flatten everything in their path. Instead of letting that dread paralyze him, Tommy focused on the texture of small tasks, checking magazines, redistributing grenades, making sure every man knew the path back and the hand signals they were to obey. He met each man's eyes in turn, anchoring them in this shared effort of deception and escape. As they waited for the first groups to gain some ground, Tommy allowed himself one brief, uninvited memory. His mother at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug, listening to the radio announce the fall of another city in Europe with a face that tried to be. He had sworn to her that he would do whatever it took to come home. In the clear light of training that had meant fighting hard, distinguishing himself, earning glory. Here, with mud freezing on his skin and the enemy steel surrounding him, whatever it took meant something much humbler, small lies, clever timing, and the courage to retreat without disintegrating into chaos. The waiting ended abruptly when a tank, perhaps emboldened, edged forward and loosed a shell that exploded close enough to flip a section of the wall down on top of one of Tommy's men. The impact knocked Tommy sideways, ears ringing. Dust filled his mouth. When he spat it out and blinked his eyes, he found Private Jensen pinned by a slab of stone, blood seeping through his. For a second the entire intricate plan teetered. The desire to rush out, to yank Jensen free and sprint with him, blazed hot. But there was no cover, no time. Any movement above the lip of the shallow cover would invite the next shell to land directly among them. Tommy's internal conflict hit him like another blast. What was a promise to a mother worth if he abandoned a wounded man in the field? His conscience screamed, tangled up with the farmer's son who had bottle-fed calves in winter storms rather than let one die. The sergeant who had watched too many brave men fall, however, understood the lethal math. If he exposed multiple soldiers to save one who could not move, he might doom the entire group. He crawled to Jensen, placing a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "Listen," he whispered, hating the trembling in his own voice. "We're not leaving you. We're going to pull back by bounds. I'll send Rees for you on the next rotation when things quiet down. You just keep your head low and pretend you're dead if they come close. You hear me?" Jensen swallowed, eyes wide, but nodded. "Good man," Tommy said, squeezing once before pulling away. It felt like a betrayal and a necessity at the same time. He ordered the next pair to fall back, then another. The line thinned like a rope being carefully. All the while, the radios played their part. Lee, half prone in the dirt, continued to feed phantom observers' reports. Kowalski, further back now with the first group, took up the chorus on another frequency, giving the impression of depth and resilience. Slowly, the knots of American soldiers melted rearward, trading distance for survival while preserving the illusion of a solid front. The German side remained cautious. They could hear the American voices giving coordinates, see the occasional flare marking adjusted targets. Their doctrine and bitter experience told them that attacks against ready American artillery could be disastrous. So they shifted to their own methodical patterns, calling in counter-battery strikes, dispatching infantry scouts ahead of the armor, probing instead of charging. The tragedy and genius of Tommy's plan lay in this. By acting like part of a well-supported American screening force, his tiny platoon convinced the enemy to fight as though against a much larger. That meant caution instead of aggression, time-consuming process instead of immediate. By the time the first German infantry patrol reached the lip of the shallow depression where Tommy's men had been, the last radio set had already crawled back through the ditch and over the low rise. All that remained in the original position were shell craters, empty foxholes, a few abandoned ammunition boxes and Private Jensen lying motionless under the as if another corpse in the churned ground. From their new line under the olive trees, Tommy and Rees watched through binoculars pilfered from destroyed half-track weeks earlier. They saw the German scouts fan out cautiously, then hunker down as their own artillery began to land on the positions they had just vacated. Shells tore into the earth, sending plumes of mud and stone skyward. It would have been a massacre if they had still been there. The sight both relieved and sickened Tommy. His hopeless trick had worked so well that now German guns were punishing empty ground with careful brutality. That empty ground should have contained his platoon. Instead, it held only one wounded man. He could not leave Jensen there to be crushed between German and Allied fire. Here the story reached what, for Tommy, would be the point of no return. He could have justified moving on, rationalizing that the lives already saved outweighed the one left behind. The bitter logic of war would have accepted such a ledger, but something in him refused. Perhaps it was the farm boy who refused to abandon a living thing. Perhaps it was the sergeant who feared what leaving Jensen would do to the souls of the men who knew it. Either way, He knew that if he let the platoon pull completely free without at least trying to get Jensen out, the choice would haunt him long after Italy. So he proposed a new, even crazier layer to his deception, a rescue carried out under the illusion of an attack. They would send a small team forward, not sneaking, but acting like an aggressive American counterpunch. Under cover of their still chattering radios and the Germans' preoccupation with bombarding empty foxholes, a handful of men would rush in, haul Jensen, and then fall back along a slightly different path that hugged the low ground even tighter. The plan was almost too much for his tired men. They had already stared down certain death once that morning. Now he was asking a few to run back toward it. His inner voice of doubt whispered that he was doing this as much to ease his own conscience as to help Jensen. Yet when he laid out the scheme, 3 volunteers spoke before he could even finish. Ruiz, of course. Kowalski, still flush with the adrenaline of their successful deception, and a quiet private named Miller, who had grown close to Jensen during training. The run back was a blur of mud and breathless seconds. They timed their move between German salvos, waiting until the artillery lifted and the scouts ducked to relay their reports. The trio sprinted low, bent double, weapons slung. Tommy stayed on the radio, keeping up the illusion of artillery adjust, throwing in occasional curses and demands for more steel on target to explain why the German positions might still be sporadic fire. Reaching Jensen, Ruiz and Miller levied the broken stone enough to drag him free, his face contorted in pain but his jaw clenched tight to keep from crying out. Shrapnel had scored his arm, and his leg was badly bruised, but he could still move if supported. They lashed a quick sling from a blanket and a belt, hoisted him between them, and began the agonizing run crawl. Halfway back, a German scout finally noticed movement. A shout in German cut through the air, followed by a burst of rifle fire that tore up the dirt a yard from Ruiz's hand. For a heartbeat, panic threatened to undo everything. Then the distant crump of their own sides' real guns sounded from behind the hills, a scheduled fire mission aimed elsewhere. Tommy pounced on that noise, screaming into the radio as if the Allied barrage were landing exactly where he wanted. To the German soldiers who had just glimpsed figures in the smoke, the renewed thunder of artillery meant one thing. They were about to be the focus of Allied attention. Their doctrine demanded they dig in, take cover, and wait out the desperate rescue party vanished back into the low ground as German scouts hugged the earth, believing shells might walk their way any second. Seconds turned into a minute turned into the long, shuddering sigh that comes when a man realizes he is still alive after fully expecting not to be. Ruiz, Miller, and Jensen tumbled behind the new line under the olive trees, gasping, smeared with more mud and blood than before, but whole. Tommy sagged back on his, feeling something tight and bitter unclench in his chest. For once, a gamble taken for reasons that were not strictly tactical had not turned into a blood price. By late morning, the battlefield had shifted. Higher up the chain, American commanders, hearing fragments of Tommy's earlier transmissions and seeing German tanks in caution rather than in charge, began to reposition genuine assets. Real artillery found the German armored concentration and began to shell it in earnest. The enemy, still wary of advancing into what they imagined a trap, gradually withdrew to more defensible ground, trading their encirclement for safety. From the perspective of the divisional situation maps, it would later look like a modest tactical adjustment, a German armored probe that had been checked and forced to pull back under threat of artillery. The reports might note light American casualties and enemy armor repulsed by accurate fire. Nobody at that level would know that much of the artillery fire was coincident, and that the initial accurate calls had been pure invention from a sergeant lying face down in the mud with a dying radio set. For Tommy and his men, the meaning was simpler. They had walked out of what should have been a steel vice because their sergeant had been willing to lie loudly and convincingly in the face of death. And because they had all chosen discipline over panic at the exact moment panic was the most understandable reaction in the world. In the quieter hours that followed, dug into a new position further back, Tommy finally let himself feel the weight of the... His hand shook when he tried to write a letter, the pencil jittering against the thin paper. He knew he could never tell his mother the details of what had happened, that nearly 40 tanks had surrounded him, that he had escaped by pretending to be far more dangerous than he was, that for a few terrible minutes he had left a wounded man behind. He settled for the same half-truths he always wrote, that things were hard, that he was doing his job, that he thought often of home. Yet inside, something had shifted. The war had burned out much of his early idealism. He no longer believed in tidy narratives of heroism and cowardice. What he did believe in, more than ever, was the value of cleverness married to courage. Training manuals and patriotic speeches talked about firepower and maneuver. They rarely mentioned the saving power of well-timed deceit and improvisation. Italy had taught him that sometimes a trick born in desperation could save more lives than any direct charge. The men around him sensed it too. In the muttered conversations that night, they spoke of that crazy radio show and how we spooked those panzers good. Jokes took shape, dark humor that masked deeper. Jensen, bandaged and propped against a log, managed a weak grin when someone suggested that he now owed Ruiz a lifetime of drinks. Years later, after the war finally ground to its exhausted conclusion and Tommy found himself back on the Kansas farm, those who had shared that Italian field with him would remember the day differently than the official history. For historians, the action outside Cisterna might remain a footnote, a minor episode in the grinding advance toward Rome. For them, it was the morning when 38 enemy tanks had turned them into prey and an improbable, hopeless trick built from memory, nerve, and lies had reversed the roles just long enough to let them live. Tommy struggled at first to fit back into the rhythms of peace. Tractor engines replaced the roar of truck convoy. The creak of windmills took the place of artillery. Yet there were still moments when the rumble of summer thunder over the plains would send him right back to that Italian field, his body tensing as if waiting for the first shell to fall. On some of those nights he sat at the kitchen table his mother had kept exactly as it was, staring at his hands and remembering the feel of the radio handset against his cheek, the hard decision to leave a man and then the desperate sprint to bring him home. News of his actions traveled slowly and in distorted form through the army bureaucracy. A junior officer who had pieced together what had happened from after-action interviews put Tommy in for a decoration. The citation, when it finally reached him months later in a crowded post-war ceremony, spoke in stiff phrases about resourceful leadership under fire and initiating deceptive measures that contributed to the repulse of superior enemy forces. It did not mention the number of tanks, or the specific, personal anguish behind the word deceptive. Tommy accepted the medal with a quiet nod, but he pinned more significance to the simple fact that most of the faces from that platoon, Ruiz, Kowalski, Miller, Lee, Jensen, were alive to attend with him. Many had scars, visible and invisible. Some would wrestle with nightmares and guilt for the rest of their days. All of them carried the memory of that field like a hidden brand. In later years, when younger relatives or curious neighbors asked about the war, Tommy rarely volunteered stories. When pressed, he might tell an edited version of the day 38 enemy tanks surrounded his small unit. He would leave out the worst of his fear and the sharp edges of his moral struggle. He would focus instead on the odd, almost absurd detail that in a battle of metal monsters, the thing that tipped the scales was not a bigger gun, but the human ability to tell a convincing lie over a crackling radio and to trust one's comrades enough to retreat in order, not run. Military historians who dug into combat reports from the Italian campaign would, much later, point to episodes like his as small examples of a much larger truth, that the brutal slog up the peninsula was not only a test of strength, but a crucible of improvisation. Officers and NCOs at every level were forced to invent, adapt, and occasionally deceive just to keep advancing a skillful, entrenched enemy. Some of those improvisations never made it into doctrinal manual. They survived instead in stories told quietly at reunions and in letters tucked into family drawers. As the number of veterans dwindled and the war receded into the realm of documentaries and textbooks, the memory of that particular Italian could easily have faded entirely. Yet here and there, in regimental histories and local archives, the hint remained. A report of a platoon cut off and apparently supported by non-existent artillery. A notation about enemy armor halting under the threat of a barrage that never fully materialized. For those who knew how to read between the lines, it was a trace of Tommy's hopeless trick. In the end, what lasted longest was not the steel of the tanks or the paper of after-action reports, but the way the men who survived carried the lesson forward. Some went into business, some into teaching, some simply back to farms very much like the one Tommy returned to. In their quieter moments, when facing problems that seemed impossible, they would sometimes remember a muddy Italian field where they had looked certain death in the face and survived because one man had refused to accept the situation at face value. War had not made them heroes in the storybook sense. It had made them tired, complicated human beings marked by loss and compromise. But on that single morning, surrounded by armor in a foreign land, they had shown a kind of courage that rarely made the newsreel. The courage to be cunning, to improvise under crushing pressure, and to care enough about each other that even one wounded man left behind was reason enough to risk everything again. That, perhaps, was the quiet legacy of Tommy Hughes and his platoon in Italy, a reminder that in the worst of circumstances, survival sometimes depends not on who is strongest, but on who can imagine a way out where none seems to exist and who values the lives around them enough to take that chance. If this story moved you, consider helping keep memories like Tommy's alive by supporting more tales of the men and women who fought through World War II's lesser-known battles. Taking a moment to like this narrative, share your thoughts or family stories in the comments, subscribe for more accounts from the forgotten, and pass it along to someone who loves World War II history. I'll help ensure that these fragile, human memories are not lost to